Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be watching from. Thank you for joining today's session. My name is Tomas Hubka. I'm marketing manager at GameAnalytics. For those who are unfamiliar, GameAnalytics started 14 years ago as analytics solution for game developers, but over the years we developed into a full IT suite of analytics tools, live ops tools, market and creative intelligence, as well as fully managed pipeline infrastructure for game analytics, including data warehousing and data export. Today, we will be talking about PEGI's upcoming changes to age rating criteria. It will be a short session, roughly 20 minutes, where I will introduce you what is changing, how it can affect operations and strategy in your studio, and give you some practical understanding. This is just an exploratory session. Our goal is not to give any legal advice, but to help you understand what is changing, why it matters, and what practical questions you should be asking. Today, I was supposed to be joined by my colleague Francesco. Maybe you have noticed, but unfortunately, he is not available, so it will be just me. Let's start with answering the main question, why? Why are we talking about this today? It is because historically we thought about age rating mainly in terms of visible content. That is, does my game include violence? Is there bad language, sexual content? Does it show fear, gambling references, and so on? But with the coming updates, we are moving the conversation towards how the game itself works. And that includes monetization, communication, and mechanics designed to bring players back. So also your retention loop. PEGI has stated that from June 26, which is roughly in 2 weeks, newly submitted games will be assessed using broader criteria, and it will cover features such as purchases of in-game content, paid random items, communication features, and features that incentivize continued play. So before we get into the changes themselves, let's just quickly define PEGI. PEGI provides age classifications for video games across 38 European countries. And it is important to note that these ratings do not mean how difficult the game is, but it means what age is this game suitable for. So today, you players, the parents, can see labels as PEGI 3, 7, 12, 16, or 18. And typically those ratings are also supported by content descriptors. So it basically tells you why such restriction is in place. Those are the reasons, as I mentioned before, is violence, bad language, fear, gambling, in-game purchases. All of these can be covered. And if we look into how PEGI works today, PEGI already includes these descriptors for certain features, including even in-game purchases. But the key change is that these features will now be more directly connected to the age rating itself, to say. When I reviewed the PEGI code of conduct, basically the process is publishers need to complete an assessment file before release, which then generates the age rating and descriptors for them. And the code also covers labeling, promotion, marketing, and safe online gameplay. So that is how that works today, and also how it will continue working going forward. And what is important to acknowledge is that these changes are not just about a badge that you have on your store page. They are more connected to product choices, player safety, advertising, platform expectations, but also a broader compliance environment around games. So they can affect your operations or your studio strategy. Now, what changes in June 2026? By the way, PEGI announced these updates on March 12th, which makes it roughly 2.5 months ago. And the core idea is that age rating should be better reflecting the overall experience of players and do not solely focus on the story or visual aspect of your content. And while we will go through who is to be impacted the most, who has highest risk of exposure, and contrary, who has the lowest risk of exposure, we can already say that this is especially relevant for mobile and live service games, where features like monetization, retention, or social communication are the central parts of the product overall. And one note here is that PEGI does not operate in isolation. Already by the end of this year, in Q4 2026, there is a possibility that loot boxes would be banned for games accessible to minors, as well as there was a call for prohibition of paid random items in games accessible to minors. Interestingly, in Germany, they implemented these criteria already 3 years ago, and after the assessment of the games, every third game got higher rating, age rating, that is. So you can see that this is not kind of a standalone situation. This operates in a broader context, and not just around Europe, but also in the US. There was a lawsuit against Valve where loot boxes of CS2 were basically lawfully considered illegal gambling. So you can see that this is also now building pressure in the US. What PEGI is doing is basically self-regulating the industry, trying to get ahead of binding legislation that might come in the future. So let's go into the nitty-gritty of which features will be affected. One thing that I would like to point out here is that PEGI will not be treating all monetization or retention mechanics equally. For example, in the bottom left corner, you can notice daily quests, rewards for returning, those will be marked as suitable for players above the age of 7, while right on the right side, penalties for not returning. These type of features, while they are still part of retention, they will be rated as suitable for 12 plus. The same thing we can see within paid random items, which are on the top right corner. It really depends what the content of those items are and how the feature works. In some instances, it might be 16 plus, in others, 18 plus. But what will be deemed as most strictly kind of monitored, assessed, are mechanics that are related to NFTs and blockchains, as well as communications with no blocking or reporting features without any moderations. So if your game have communication features in them, and now we are speaking of games that are to be released after June 26, those will be under higher scrutiny. Those are just the kind of categories, examples that PEGI announced. But of course, this will work kind of on individual basis of what a feature looks like and what content it encompasses. And it will be assessed during the assessment prior to the release. So why this matters legally and operationally? When a rating changes, the impact can go beyond the rating itself, right? So it can affect how a game is positioned, which audiences it can target, how it's marketed, and how platforms or parents, for that sake, perceive it. For your team, the challenge is documentation. You need to know what features exist, how they work, whether they involve payment, is the outcome random, are communications moderated, and are younger players exposed to these systems? Because we've seen that all of these restrictions are for audience below age of 18. When studios react by introducing, let's say, age gates, parental controls, different experiences for different age groups, this can be a space for compliance and data protection questions to come in play as well. And that is where kind of the operational hurdle might come in as well, because suddenly you need to start raising questions about age assurance, data collection, consent, and privacy. So although it seems like you just have a feature in your game and you need to rate it, that it can actually affect way more of what you're doing. So what might be considered a higher risk? Generally, studios should pay particular attention to mechanics that combine payments, randomness pressure, or child audiences, let's say. So as the features that will now fall under the scrutiny of having to be assessed are paid loot boxes or random reward systems. Gacha style mechanics involving real money, those are typically found in Genshin, Japanese anime games. If your game has any type of special offers that are time limited or quantity limited, and you can typically see it by having this scarcity timer, that is also a feature that now can cause issues. Streaks, daily questions, or FOMO-based retention. I've got here a screenshot of Brawl Stars, where every day you unlock a new reward. If you've got daily quests, you've got daily gift streaks, you will be also subjected to assessment. And lastly, we already spoke about these If there are any user-generated communications, any open space for conversations, chatting, and you do not have any blocking or reporting features, the chat is unmoderated, you are falling under the risk. But a lot is still unclear. So while PEGI says that the criteria will apply to newly submitted games from June 2026, the question is how consistently will the criteria be applied? And also, while it is only for new games that will be submitted, if you have a legacy game and you make a major update, PEGI suggests that you should also let the updates to be reassessed. However, there is no clear guidance on this side. You can read all the questions that you can ask. A lot is still unclear, but it is good to have an awareness of these changes and how they can affect your future releases. You can speaking of the enforcement, PEGI has complaints and enforcement processes, and in the past, the enforcement cases showed us that publishers can be fined for issues such as missing or incorrect descriptors, but the real world impact will also depend on platform behavior, publisher compliance. So this is really just one part of a puzzle that you should be aware of. Now let's look into who is most likely to be impacted. I've mentioned it previously that live service games are the ones that are at most stake of being assessed with more scrutiny. But generally, we can speak of mobile free-to-play games because those are very likely to have some type of monetization features or retention loops. We looked at the ages, at the restrictions, and of course, any games that are aimed at children or teens are immediately in this group of most exposed, most under the risk of bigger assessment. And as mentioned previously, social games with open communications or games relying on urgency-based monetization, those games, studios with games like this should also be on the lookout. On the contrary, less exposed games are premium games. So those games that possibly do not have in-app purchases, that do not rely on retention loops that heavily, or if they have in-app purchases, they've got direct purchases, but are cosmetics only. They do not impact how players can play the game. They might be an exempt. Next are games that are targeting adults or teenagers over 16 years old, and games with limited or well-moderated communication. Now, probably the most important part, and that is, what does it mean for developers? I've divided these into two buckets. One is product and design, and the second one is compliance and operations. So if we start with product and design, the development part, the practical takeaway here is that rating implications should move earlier in development process. And instead of discovering late in launch planning that some mechanics may affect the renting, your team should evaluate these questions during feature design. So that's when I mentioned documentation being an important part of your processes going forward. Now, when we are looking at compliance and operation, from this perspective, it's mostly about creating a review process. When a new monetization or social feature is proposed, teams should ask, does this involve payment? Does it involve randomness? Does it create urgency? Does it target or affect minors? Does it require moderation? Is there a need to collect some additional data for me? But as I mentioned, this does not only affect the development of game, but also marketing, user acquisition. So from a marketing perspective, a rating is not just some metadata, but it actually influences who you target, how you describe your game, which creatives you run, and how parents perceive that product for that sake. So, if a game moves from PEGI 3 to 7 or from 12 to 16 because of a monetization or retention feature, that suddenly can create a positioning question whether the game is still being marketed as family friendly. Perhaps not. Are the store assets aligned with the rating, or are UA campaigns reaching the right age groups? So there are a lot of questions that you need to ask during your marketing as well. But as a final takeaway, I would like to stress that this is not necessarily a crisis of any sort. It may not even affect you, and it definitely does not affect every studio equally. But it is a meaningful signal because we want to create a space where everyone feels safe, and PEGI is essentially moving towards rating the broader player experience, including monetization, retention, online interaction. So while for developers, this means some mechanics that used to be treated mainly as product or monetization decisions, those might now have some consequences. But for marketers, it means audience targeting and positioning may need closer review. And for compliance teams, it means documentation and internal process review processes are now more important. So the practical advice is to start early, review your mechanics, document how they work, understand which audiences are exposed to them, and think about safety and transparency by design. This is pretty much everything from our side to let you know about what changes are happening. We will be sharing the slides with you. We'll be sharing also additional resources so you can review them yourself, see if your future releases will be affected by these changes. And unless there are any questions, I will wish everyone a great rest of the day.